Victoria calls itself the Garden State, and on paper it earns the name. Manicured botanical gardens in the middle of Melbourne, rolling vineyards across the Yarra Valley, wildflowers carpeting the Grampians every spring, tree-lined boulevards in every regional town built during the gold rush. Tourists picture cool climate wine tours and autumn leaves in the Dandenongs. What the nickname conveniently leaves out is a colonial and industrial history soaked in violence, isolation, and disaster on a scale that rivals anywhere else in the country. This is the state where a miners' rebellion turned into open warfare against the government, where bushranger siege ended in fire and gunsmoke, where migrants and Aboriginal families alike were processed through camps that promised protection and delivered something closer to control. In this video, we are counting down 12 dark chapters buried beneath Victoria's postcard image. Stay until the end, because the final one is the site that gave the entire state its garden nickname, and it began as anything but a garden. So settle in, and let's begin. In the goldfields town of Ballarat, a low wooden stockade once stood where miners made their final stand against colonial authority, an event that remains one of the only armed rebellions in Australian history. By 1854, tens of thousands of prospectors had flooded the Victorian goldfields, and resentment had built for years over expensive mining licenses that miners were forced to pay regardless of whether they found any gold, enforced through aggressive police raids that many considered corrupt and arbitrary. On December 3, 1854, colonial troops and police stormed a hastily built stockade at dawn, catching the miners largely by surprise, and the resulting battle killed at least 22 miners and several soldiers within a span of roughly 15 minutes. Many of the dead miners were reportedly bayoneted after the fighting had already effectively ended, a detail that fueled lasting public anger over the severity of the government's response. The rebellion's leaders were later tried for treason but acquitted by sympathetic juries, and the incident directly contributed to major democratic reforms in the colony, including expanded voting rights. Today, a quiet memorial garden marks the site. The small township of Glenrowan in northeastern Victoria is permanently linked to the final, violent chapter of Australia's most famous bushranger. By 1880, Ned Kelly and his gang had spent years evading police across Victoria's rural districts, but their story ended here, when Kelly and his men took over the town's hotel, held dozens of local residents hostage, and prepared for a direct confrontation with police who had been tipped off to their plan. On June 28, 1880, police surrounded the hotel and a lengthy siege began, during which Kelly, wearing homemade armour forged from stolen plough parts, emerged to fight in a scene that has since become one of the most reproduced images in Australian folklore. The siege ended with the hotel deliberately set alight, killing several of Kelly's associates who remained trapped inside, while Kelly himself was captured after being shot multiple times in the legs, the armour having protected his torso but left his limbs exposed. He was tried, convicted, and hanged in Melbourne later that year. Glenrowan today markets itself heavily around this history, complete with a giant fiberglass Kelly statue, though the original hotel site itself burned to nothing in a single violent night. Near the coastal town of Portland, Victoria's oldest European settlement, a stretch of coastline known as the Convincing Ground holds one of the earliest and most disputed episodes of frontier violence in the colony's history. In 1833 or 1834, a dispute broke out between European whalers and local Gunditjmara people over a beached whale carcass that both groups considered rightfully theirs, and the confrontation escalated into an armed attack by the whalers against the Aboriginal group gathered on the beach. Historical accounts, drawn primarily from settler testimony given decades later, describe the killing of a significant number of Gunditjmara people, though the exact death toll remains disputed and was likely minimised in official colonial records at the time. The location's name itself, referring to a place where a dispute was violently settled, has become a documented symbol of the broader pattern of frontier violence that accompanied European expansion across Western Victoria in the decades that followed. The Convincing Ground remains a site of deep significance to the Gunditjmara community today, and its history has been the subject of ongoing native title and historical recognition processes well into the 21st century. On the goldfields of northeastern Victoria in 1857, the Buckland Valley became the site of one of the largest and most violent anti-Chinese riots in Australian colonial history. Chinese miners had arrived on the Victorian goldfields in large numbers throughout the 1850s, often working previously abandoned claims with methodical efficiency that generated resentment among European miners who viewed them as unwelcome competition. On July 4, 1857, a mob of several hundred European miners descended on the Chinese camp at Buckland, destroying tents and equipment, beating residents, and driving an estimated 2,000 Chinese miners from the valley in a single chaotic night, many fleeing into freezing winter conditions without adequate clothing or supplies. At least 3 Chinese miners are known to have died as a direct result of the riot, either from violence or from exposure during the forced flight, though the true toll is considered likely higher given the chaos of the event and the limited record-keeping regarding Chinese casualties at the time. The riot became one of several similar incidents across Victoria's goldfields during this period, ultimately contributing to the introduction of formal, government-sanctioned restrictions on Chinese immigration into the colony. In the historic town of Beechworth, a grand two-storey building known as Mayday Hills once operated as one of regional Victoria's largest psychiatric institutions, admitting patients from across the northeast for well over a century. Opened in 1867, the asylum was designed according to progressive Victorian-era theories that believed elegant architecture and landscaped grounds could itself contribute to patient recovery, resulting in an unusually ornate institutional building surrounded by extensive gardens and mature trees. Despite the pleasant exterior, treatment inside followed the same patterns common to asylums of the era: restraint, isolation, and later electroconvulsive therapy, administered to patients whose conditions ranged from genuine severe mental illness to what would today be recognized as treatable depression or anxiety. At its peak, the facility housed over 1,200 patients, and its own internal cemetery holds the remains of hundreds who died during their confinement, many buried under numbers rather than names due to strict rules of institutional anonymity applied even in death. The asylum closed in 1995, and the building has since been repurposed into a boutique hotel and gallery space, meaning modern guests can now book overnight stays in wards where patients were once involuntarily confined for decades. Near the regional city of Wodonga on the New South Wales border, the Bonagilla Migrant Reception Centre processed hundreds of thousands of new arrivals to Australia during the decades following the Second World War, becoming the largest and longest operating facility of its kind in the country's history. Opened in 1947, Bonagilla was designed to house and process displaced persons and assisted migrants from across Europe, offering basic accommodation, English lessons, and job placement services intended to integrate new arrivals into Australian society. In practice, conditions were Spartan and heavily regimented, with families housed in converted military huts left over from wartime use, communal facilities offering little privacy, and a rigid bureaucratic system that separated families by gender in some accommodation blocks, causing significant distress among new arrivals already dealing with displacement and cultural dislocation. Tensions boiled over in 1961 when migrant residents, frustrated by chronic unemployment and poor conditions, staged a significant riot that drew national attention to the facility's shortcomings. Over its 24 years of operation, more than 300,000 migrants passed through Bonagilla, and today a small museum on the site preserves several original huts. At the tip of the Mornington Peninsula, Point Nepean's remote, windswept headland has served, at various points in its history, as a quarantine station, a military fortification, and an officer training facility, each layer of use adding to a site with a genuinely unsettling accumulated history. The quarantine station opened in 1852, processing ships suspected of carrying infectious disease before allowing passengers to enter Melbourne, and thousands of immigrants passed through isolation wards here, some never leaving, buried in a small cemetery on the grounds. During both World Wars, the headland was heavily fortified as part of Melbourne's coastal defence network, and its narrow, dangerous strait, known locally as the Rip, has claimed numerous shipwrecks over the decades due to unpredictable currents and submerged rock formations that continue to challenge vessels today. In one particularly notable incident in 1967, Australian Prime Minister Harold Holt disappeared while swimming at nearby Cheviot Beach, presumed drowned in the same treacherous waters. His body never recovered despite an extensive search, an event that remains one of the most prominent unsolved mysteries in Australian political history. The headland today is a national park, its old fortifications and quarantine buildings standing quietly above waters that have claimed ships, immigrants, and a sitting Prime Minister alike. In the old goldfields town of Malden, a small hilltop reserve gives little indication that it once held Tarrengower, a women's prison that operated in one form or another across parts of the 20th century, holding female offenders in a remote regional setting far removed from Melbourne's main correctional facilities. Established initially in the early 20th century and later repurposed as a minimum security women's prison, Tarrengower held prisoners in conditions shaped heavily by the isolation of its rural location, with limited family visitation given the distance from major population centres where most prisoners' families lived. Historical accounts describe the facility's regime as focused heavily on domestic labour and agricultural work, reflecting broader gendered assumptions about appropriate rehabilitation for female offenders that dominated correctional thinking well into the later 20th century. The site's isolation, intended partly as a security measure given the difficulty of escape across open rural terrain, also meant that oversight and external scrutiny of conditions inside remained limited for much of its operational history. Today, the site operates in a different capacity within the regional correctional system, and few visitors driving through Malden's heritage streetscape realise the hill above town carries this particular institutional history. The coastal town of Wonthaggi in Gippsland grew almost entirely around a single industry, coal, and the underground mine that sustained the town for decades also claimed a significant number of lives through a series of underground disasters that locals remember far more vividly than most outsiders realise. The State Coal Mine opened in 1909 specifically to supply Victoria's railways with a reliable domestic coal source, reducing dependence on imported coal from New South Wales, and the mine quickly grew into the town's central economic and social institution. Underground conditions were dangerous by any standard, and the mine recorded multiple serious accidents over its operational lifetime, including explosions and rockfalls that killed miners in isolated incidents spread across different decades, cumulative losses that weighed heavily on a workforce drawn almost entirely from the local community. Miner strikes, including a lengthy and bitter dispute in 1934, further defined the town's identity, reflecting ongoing tensions between dangerous working conditions and the wages offered to sustain them. The mine finally closed in 1968 as cheaper alternative energy sources made the operation economically unviable, and today the site operates as a heritage museum, its preserved shafts and tunnels open for tours that walk visitors through the same dark, cramped conditions that defined the town's working life for nearly 60 years. At the southernmost tip of mainland Australia, Wilson's Promontory's rugged granite coastline has claimed ships for well over a century, its combination of exposed headlands, unpredictable weather, and treacherous currents making it one of the most dangerous stretches of coast in Victoria. The Wilson's Promontory Lighthouse, completed in 1859, was built specifically to warn vessels away from the peninsula's granite cliffs after a string of wrecks in the surrounding waters during the colony's early shipping era, and lighthouse keepers stationed here endured extreme isolation for decades, with supply runs sometimes disrupted for weeks at a time by severe weather that cut the headland off entirely. Despite the lighthouse's presence, wrecks continued to occur periodically well into the 20th century, with several vessels lost to sudden storms that could develop with little warning in the notoriously unpredictable waters off the Prom. Lighthouse keepers and their families lived in near total isolation, raising children with no access to schools beyond correspondence lessons, and several historical accounts describe the psychological toll of such prolonged remoteness on families stationed there across multiple generations. Today the lighthouse remains operational, though automated, and the national park surrounding it draws hikers largely unaware of how many ships met their end just offshore from the trails they now walk. Rising from farmland northwest of Melbourne, Hanging Rock is a striking volcanic formation that has become one of Victoria's most mythologized locations, its genuine geological strangeness blurred for generations of Australians with a famous work of fiction that many still mistake for a factual event. The rock formation itself, a mamelon created by volcanic activity roughly 6 million years ago, holds deep cultural and spiritual significance for the traditional owners of the region, who used the site for thousands of years before European settlement disrupted access to it. The 1967 novel Picnic at Hanging Rock, and the acclaimed 1975 film adaptation that followed, depicted a fictional disappearance of schoolgirls at the site during a Valentine's Day picnic in 1900, a story presented with such deliberate ambiguity that many viewers and readers over the decades genuinely believed it depicted real events, despite no such disappearance ever having occurred in Victoria's actual historical record. The rock's genuinely unusual acoustics and disorienting maze-like rock formations likely contributed to the story's cultural staying power, and locals still field regular questions from tourists convinced the fictional vanishing was real. The confusion has become its own strange layer of the site's history, a modern myth built on top of an ancient landform that needed no invented tragedy to already feel unsettling. Near the coastal town of Warrnambool, a collapsed volcanic crater now filled with lakes and dense wetland forest carries the peaceful name Tower Hill, a site now celebrated as one of Australia's earliest and most successful environmental restoration projects, though its deeper history is considerably darker than its current garden-like appearance suggests. The crater had sustained the Gunditjmara people for thousands of years before European pastoral settlement in the 1830s and 1840s brought violent conflict to the region, part of the same broader pattern of frontier violence that swept through Western Victoria during this period, displacing Aboriginal communities from land that had sustained them for millennia. Following settlement, the crater's native vegetation was almost completely cleared for grazing and quarrying, leaving a barren, eroded landscape that by the mid-20th century bore no resemblance to its original forested state. Beginning in 1961, an ambitious replanting project used a colonial-era painting as a reference guide to restore the crater's original vegetation, eventually succeeding in returning the site to something resembling its pre-settlement appearance, complete with returning native wildlife. Tower Hill's transformation from violent frontier and stripped wasteland into Victoria's celebrated garden showcase captures, more than any other site in the state, exactly how the Garden State earned its name by quietly growing over the ground where its darkest history took place.